The following is a research presentation on instructional approaches to developing mathematical perseverance and growth mindset in secondary mathematics classrooms. My name is Stephanie Landez. Thank you for watching. In the following slides, we will go over an introduction to both what growth mindset is and how to foster mathematical perseverance in students. Look at some of the emerging technology and neuroscience imaging that is now available to help measure educational research. Look at the existing research in mindset and productive failure. Determine if there are any impacts on learning that teachers should be cognizant of, and then go through a couple of different recommendations for classroom application. How neuroscience and educational psychology are changing education research. My driving question and focus for this research paper was trying to determine how can educators build skills that foster mathematical perseverance and combat the increasing apathy in secondary mathematics classrooms. We're going to look at whether or not math is actually an uphill battle, different ways to address classroom diversity, the need for remediation and increasing skills from previous years, how to work with accommodations, and much more. How to also break fixed mindsets that have already been established in students, because oftentimes when they get to a secondary mathematics classroom, they have already established their own ways of thinking. Making connections between the existing qualitative research and the new novelty technologies that can help aid educational research, and then once again looking at the classroom applications. So the growing concern here is that despite all of these new state laws and federal laws and Common Core curriculum and protections and accommodations and all the new curriculum that states are starting to roll out as a result of Common Core curriculum, there really still has not been significant improvement in the number of students who leave middle school and enter high school at proficient or above. Obviously, ideally, above proficient would be what we would hope to get in a regular or general education classroom setting. But even as recently as 2017, only 34% of students are testing at or above proficient, and that is not up much in the last decade. It's been hovering in those low to mid 30s for about 10 years now. The interesting thing, though, is especially for myself as a high school math teacher, I tend to think that most students just don't like math. They've got negative mindsets and attitudes towards math. But in a recent survey done just last year by the mathematical gurus at Texas Instruments, those results don't actually, the survey results don't actually correlate with the proficiency results at all. In fact, 46% of students who were surveyed in 2018 actually love or enjoy taking mathematics classes. Only 24% dislike it. 3 out of 4 students admit hearing an adult negatively speak about math, which is something that I've experienced in the classroom as well. And I get many parents whose children struggle with math who instantly say, well, I've never been good at math myself, so I wouldn't expect much from them. But most students, 68% of students, would like math more if they understood how it applied to their future. And they do, 77% believe that success in math class means that they will have more successful careers both in college and in the workforce. So students, number one, understand that math is important, but number two, they don't actually have the same disdain for it that the proficiency results and grades in the classroom reflect. So what exactly is growth mindset and mathematical mindsets? Back in 2006, Carol Dweck released this book called Mindset, The New Psychology of Success, and she really is, the godmother, for lack of better words, of growth mindset and looking into what the difference between a growth and a fixed mindset is and what those applications and educational settings may look like. And then Jo Boaler is somebody who took an extension of all of that beautiful research that Carol Dweck did, and she's applied it directly to mathematics. Jo Boaler is currently a professor and a leading education researcher out in England, and really is just kind of the person that wraps everything Carol Dweck has to say about positive mindsets, mathematical mindsets, academic mindsets, and puts it in the context of how we can help students reach their potential through different creative ways of approaching mathematics and really getting away from just root algorithms. Well, let's understand what mindsets are in the first place. In going through multiple different reviews and studies, there are researchers who talk about obviously the growth and the fixed mindsets, but then there's also academic mindsets and mathematical mindsets. So, what do we know about all of these? First of all, somebody with a fixed mindset is under the impression that failure is innate, that you're either good at something or you're not, that abilities don't really change. Some people are just more talented naturally at certain things, and intelligence isn't necessarily something that can be grown or developed. And growth mindset challenges that. Number one, it challenges just the way of thinking, but number two, it proves that the more you adopt methods of growth mindsets, that your brain literally changes and there's new synapses that grow and it strengthens, and really growth mindset goes under the premise that everything we do is malleable. Challenges and mistakes ultimately result in success, and everything is an opportunity to grow from. Whether you succeed or fail, excuse me, it was still a growth opportunity altogether. The other interesting aspects of mindsets that were covered in some of the literature I reviewed is just that the thought process of an academic mindset and the different impacts academic mindsets can have, and the different types of academic mindsets there are. One that really resonated with me was a mindset of belonging. Do students feel they belong in your classroom? Do students feel that they're accepted, that their opinions are valued? If students walk into a classroom where the focus is always on the teacher and there isn't really any autonomy in learning, then they're less likely to feel connected to the teacher, number one, to the classroom, and to the ultimately to the curriculum and the learning. The more students are able to have an academic focus, that they have control over their own learning, that the teacher's more of a facilitator in the classroom, the more likely they are to engage with the material. So ultimately, this comes down to brain science, right? So what is the function and physiology of how mindset adapts and grows within the different cortical networks that we have? And also, what does it look like when your brain is doing math in general? So the cortical connections that have been discovered in math, if you look here at the right-hand side, this is a study that specifically looks at the difference between when your brain is processing numbers and when your brain is processing visual and word form areas. And the figure that is shown there very clearly demonstrates that different parts of your brain are activated depending on what type of activity you're doing. Studies have identified that two principal regions of the brains that deal with mathematical processing, meaning number processing and calculation, are known to activate the bilateral interparietal sulci. So I tried my best to try to identify what part of the brain that is based on this image here on the lower right. But then a second number-related activation has also been observed in the bilateral inferior temporal regions. So we're activating two different portions of the brain when you're dealing with mathematics. And then there is an ongoing study called the Pediatric Imaging Neurocondition and Genetic Study that identifies, like I said, this number form and visual word form areas of the brain, and goes in further into where that activates the occipitotemporal cortex more towards the back of the brain as well. So we can see that there are at a minimum a number of 3 regions of the brain that are activated when dealing with mathematical processing. But the brain on, I put here, the brain on growth or growth mindset is a completely different set of brain function as well. But the key takeaway with growth mindset is that neuroplasticity is a growing understanding, and immediately invalidates the belief that the former belief that we only used 10% of our brain. And in fact, it's shown that the more we fire synapses, the more it triggers neighboring synapses. And ultimately, the neuroplasticity of synapses firing generates new neurons in certain regions of the brain and new synapses that help to strengthen existing skills and experiences and creating neural connections. And those strengthened synapses and that repetition just continues to strengthen it as in a muscle would anywhere else in the body. And we just know that the more you challenge your brain and the more we look at mistakes-based learning, literally the stronger your brain grows. And the more fixed mindset types of operations we deal with, those connections in the brain are weakened or are not used, and eventually, especially during adolescence, that type of gray unused matter ends up essentially becoming past memories and distant and hard to reach. So they end up becoming irrelevant in the long run. So the more we use the brain and the more we challenge the brain and the more we struggle, the more it actually strengthens the thought processes. This is neuroscientific evidence of what portions of the brain growth mindset and intrinsic motivation activate. Intrinsic motivation is very closely correlated to growth mindset, and it looks at essentially what motivates students or people in general to do certain things. And if it is an extrinsic motivator, then we're talking about students needing some kind of external reward to want to improve. However, intrinsic motivation does not require anybody to do or say anything. It does not require praise. And ultimately, it's an underlying mechanism for students to have their own agency in finding out new knowledge. It is students who operate with a growth mindset and have those intrinsic desires to succeed. They both come up from a perspective of individual success and wanting to attain mastery and find purpose in everything they do. All of these different areas here on this screen that talk about growth mindset and behaviors and intrinsic mindset have a lot to do with the way our brain already processes errors and monitors different functions that we do on a daily basis. But if we start to make students more aware that these are already being engaged, then we can use that error processing to our own benefit. So the new technology, these technologies themselves are not actually new. We already had existing EEG studies that have been used for years to study things like seizures and epilepsy and migraines, and the same thing for fMRI technology. But now we're just starting to tap into how that is being used in educational research. When we're looking at the two different types of studies that are measuring that the areas of the brain, that are activated during exercises with growth mindset and exercises with mathematics, you can see here the difference between the EEG and the fMRI. When we're looking at areas where we know the temporal lobe is more activated or more directly measured, then it looks like the EEG would be the better measure there. But when we're talking about things that need more spatial resolution, the fMRI is the better option. So these two can be used interchangeably. They could be used in correlation with each other. And oftentimes I believe they're going to continue to be used to supplement findings within the same study. As you can see, though, it looks like the fMRI currently still requires extensive expertise. It is not portable and it requires significant more cost to it. So I imagine while we're still in the novelty of this types of research, the EEG will continue to be the more commonly used method of study. But I believe that both will grow as the applications grow and the accessibility increases. We're going to see a lot of classroom applications with the two coming forward. The direct impact on learning that growth mindset and understanding the mathematical connections have in the classroom is ultimately is the essence of students understanding that they grow through failure. And as long as failure is structured and supported and reinforced and corrected along the way, it really is a tool for growth, not a detriment. Ultimately, the research all showed that when you deploy learning, when you deploy instructional strategies in multiple ways, it validates that the brain processes both math and growth mindset in multiple facets of the brain. Just in the way the brain processes visual imagery for things like unit circles and geometry, that activates one portion of the brain because it's very visually based. But when we're talking about using route facts and algebra and trigonometry and algorithms and just repetitive equations, that's an entirely different portion of the brain. And then when you actually get to more lofty geometric statements and Euclidean decisions, it actually starts to activate classical language regions of the brain. So the neuroimaging data that we have now is essentially validation that when we use differentiation strategies and different methods of different instructional approaches, that not only does it have a higher capability of reaching all learners, but it's literally reaching different portions of the brain, which helps reinforce once again those synapses and trigger the increased connectivity. I really liked the quote that I have at the bottom. Ultimately, these error correction and learning strategies thus conduct to better academic achievement. And as long as we as educators and then in turn teach our students that the error correction, the making a mistake and understanding where we made that mistake is really where the growth occurs, then we're helping our students in the long run when it's done with the proper supports and structure. That I also looked into the concept of making sure that we are conscientious of the different cultures and diversities that we have in our classroom and addressing the needs of all of our students in special education, our English language learners. And then at the beginning, I discussed that 30 to 35% of students who are proficient, but if you look just below that, the disproportionality, the disparity for our Black and Hispanic students is significantly lower. So we need to make sure that we are addressing the classroom instructional strategies and that academic belonging for all students to help close that achievement gap with intentionality, not just saying it, but being very cognizant of what we're doing in the classroom and that our minority students are in need of more assistance when they've demonstrated that there is a struggle and that maybe growth mindset is not a concept that they're familiar with, that we're really helping to coach and encourage them to adopt those mindsets as well, because ultimately research shows that it does help to improve scores in mathematics over time. So 5 primary classroom recommendations and how to apply the findings about both mathematical connections and growth mindset through the brain science and the existing research that we have. First, we need to make sure we are teaching growth mindset and neuroplasticity. Adolescents are not only old enough to understand the different, at least to understand the entry level concepts of neuroplasticity and growing new synapses and one fire setting off another, so on and so forth. But the fact that their brain is already going through chemical changes and puberty and things of that nature, it may help them to find more reason in what's in the world around them in general. Implementing mistakes-based learning, that is my number one takeaway from this whole thing. Use student work, use activities like My Favorite No that show students, look, hey, you started properly, but then something went wrong. Can you, number one, identify where the error was? Can you fix the error and can you repeat the process with a different similar problem and produce better results? And then one of the activities I use in my classroom on a regular basis is mini whiteboards. I have students work on a mathematical problem. They're not allowed to erase their board at all. They show me their board so that I can check for general understanding and I can recognize where my classroom's at percentage-wise. I complete the problem on the board in front of me. Students check their work line by line, and they are only allowed to erase their board when I erase mine. And so even if they make a mistake, they can immediately check and figure out what they did wrong, and then we repeat the process with a future similar problem. Number three, collaborative groups are crucial. When students have an opportunity to discuss mathematics aloud and exemplify mathematical reasoning and use their peers who are either slightly ahead of them or slightly behind them for growth, they're able to then open healthy debates regarding whether or not their answers are correct. And if two students got different answers, they can work together to try to determine who was correct, and collaborative groups allow students the opportunity to have various degrees of freedom in what and how they're learning. Learning intentions and goal-based journaling was a concept I had not been familiar with until this literature review, and I really like that when students are aware of what their learning intentions are, they can set themselves individualized micro goals, and that concept for growth mindset gives students tangible things to work towards as opposed to their overall goal being to get an A in a class. You want their goals to be more, for example, if a student struggled on the last exam, you can put a spiral review goal in there for students. You can put a proficiency goal in there. You can put a completion goal. If students are only working for the reward of a grade, then they're going to lose the benefit of the process and the struggle and the mistakes that happen in between. And lastly, classroom environment is key. Introducing the power of yet into everything students do. If they are complaining that they don't understand something, making sure that they understand they don't understand it yet, and that the positive reinforcement and the positive praise that is coming is regardless of whether or not they get a problem right. It's about their process and their intention along the way. We really need to begin to emphasize progress over pure talent, progress over intelligence, progress over grades, letting students take pride in the progress they make, whether they're on track with the rest of their peers or not. And lastly, for a closing quote, in rethinking what mathematical failure means, not allowing students to believe that it is black and white, right and wrong situations, educators can help students to adopt mathematical thinking as a practice where constructs can be challenged and failure can be argued. That really was kind of my summarizing statement of the whole process. In medicine, we're okay with calling it a practice. So why not adopt that same thought process in mathematics? Everything is a journey in life. And yes, mathematics more frequently than not has black and white answers, but the journey to understanding how to get there is just as much of as part of the process as the end result is. Thank you so much for taking the time to review this research with me. And in closing, here are the various resources that it took to come up with this research paper.